The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. The Johnson Center's mission is to study and understand the role of economic freedom in the creation of prosperity. We study economic freedom, usually reduced into a spreadsheet and as part of a statistical analysis. As academic economists, we study economic freedom but experience relatively little of its consequences in our professional lives. If you try to start or grow a small business, you will be exercising economic freedom or realizing the consequences if economic freedom is restricted. Consequently, entrepreneurs and small business owners have a unique perspective on how government regulation and taxes affect their ability to succeed and grow. What are some of the ways in which regulations disproportionately impact businesses in Alabama, and how might some of these impacts be reduced through reform? Joining me on EconVersations today to discuss these issues is Rosemary Elebash, the director of Alabama's chapter of the National Federation of Independent Businesses. Rosemary is a graduate of Troy University, and in her role, she talks to many state business owners across Alabama. So she has some great perspectives and stories, I think, to share about economic freedom and the impact of government on businesses. Well, welcome back to Troy, Rosemary, and welcome to EconVersations.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today. It's always a pleasure to be back on the campus.
So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your organization, the NFIB, or the National Federation of Independent Businesses.
Dan, this week we're actually celebrating our 75th anniversary in Washington, D.C., and President Trump is actually our keynote luncheon speaker right now as we're speaking.
Oh, excellent.
So we are delighted to have him and our business owners. We've got about 700 that travel to Washington, D.C. from across the nation. Mm-hmm. But NFIB has an office in all 50 states, and in the Washington, D.C. office, we are somewhat unique in the way that we are formed. Our business owners actually direct our public policy, and when I say that, I send out a state ballot and the DC office sends out a national ballot, and our members actually vote. So when we get to 70% or above, that means NFIB can take a position on a particular piece of legislation or even a rule or regulation. The other thing that we do that is very unique is we actually grade elected officials on how their votes are on small business. So you will hear small business owners many times in election years talk about, you know, I'm the candidate for small business, I'm the one that'll support small business. So everybody's our friend in an election year, but we do hold them accountable on their votes.
Well, okay, and a part of what you do is interact, or I guess, are you a lobby group? Would you call that as a lobby group? But you represent the interests of small businesses with government, because many laws and regulations impact small businesses, right?
We do, and I actually represent Alabama members before the 3 branches of government.
Okay.
So interactive between judicial, executive, and legislative branches. And these issues that I lobby on behalf of members are actually where NFIB members have called me and said, let me tell you my story. And that's how many of these issues come to light.
So if somebody wanted to start a business, I found this kind of interesting just as a way to sort of illustrate some of the impacts. This is from the Alabama Small Business Development Center Network, a publication that they put together as a guide for would-be entrepreneurs who wanted to start a small business. And it's like the second slide here is some of the different factors you have to consider about your business plan and whether you're going to have success. And the third one there is just a little small, but I mean, it lists some of the different taxes and regulations that businesses have to comply with. And I think this is something that, you know, if you've never run a business, you might not be aware of just how much compliance and how important that compliance happens to be.
Dan, it is onerous, I must say, when you look at starting a new business, and this is for any type of business. But then if you get more specialized, like if you wanted to start a restaurant, well, you have a whole list of criteria from the Department of Public Health before you can ever open your doors. If you're a contractor, you know, you have very specific things that you may have to do to comply with ADEM, which is the Alabama Department of Environmental Management. So, you know, you have an overall business that you have to comply with, but then when you're specialized in your business model, then you also have to comply with all those rules and regulations. And it is really a daunting task. What I tell business owners who are thinking about starting a business, you know, the first thing is find yourself a good banker. You need that friend as you go along. You may have saved money in order to start a business, but you're going to need a line of credit. So that is the one thing that I say that you must do first, is find that. And then not only does the Small Business Development Centers, and I must tell you that the one here in Troy is extremely good, and I have recommended several people that they drive to Troy and meet with them, but they are located across the state. The other thing that is available for new and existing businesses is Atlas Alabama, and it's atlasalabama.gov, and it is a creation from the Alabama Small Business Commission, which I also am honored to chair. And this was actually started in 2014, and we add new content to that often about things that you need to do.
And when we get into this issue of regulation and the impacts of regulation on business, it's important to point out that usually, hopefully, any regulation has an important purpose. So you talk about the public health regulations if you're going to start a restaurant. I mean, clearly we have a value, you know, the value, we don't want people getting sick if they're going to a restaurant. We have an interest in making sure that the kitchen is clean and everything. But sometimes there are ways in which regulations are formulated or enforced that impose unnecessary burdens on businesses, and I think that's a big part of what we want to talk about here today. These cases where regulations are burdening businesses sort of unnecessarily.
Yes, and you know, probably one of the most unique things in Alabama is they are required to have a business license, and this is a municipal business license in most cases. But the Alabama legislature has allowed cities to determine whether it's fee-based or based on gross receipts. So if you have, good example, if you are a heating and air conditioning company, and you probably are the best one, so you know, you have calls from different municipalities, from homeowners and from contractors who say, I want you to come install this, and then homeowners that say, I need you to repair. Well, that heating and air conditioning business must have a business license from each and every municipality they may go in, regardless of whether they may go there that year, because it is, they get a fine and a penalty if they don't purchase that business license by a certain date at the beginning of the year.
Okay.
So that is a really big burden. I do have one member up in Northwest Alabama, and he is in the oil distribution business. He purchases over 70 business licenses each year. He has one employee that is dedicated to filling out the forms and remitting the checks to each of those municipalities. And you know, you think about it, the person, he told me her salary was between $35,000 and $40,000. So that $35,000 to $40,000 employee is not growing his business.
All right.
She is just there to maintain a business license.
And in this, the fact that regulations can have an unexpected impact on businesses is something that politicians unfortunately don't always necessarily get. Hopefully voices like yours can help share this. But this is one of my favorite quotes from George McGovern, a longtime U.S. Senator, who I guess after he retired from politics decided to open, I think it was a hotel. He joined the business world and realized that, like, he, you know, as he says here, he wishes he knew exactly what he was doing to businesses during all of his years as a politician. It would have made him a better politician.
Well, and I think it does. The one thing that has been beneficial, but particularly in the Alabama legislature, is in 2011, we elected many small business owners. So it's been a much more friendly environment for business owners in the last 2 quadrenniums. And I actually counted up the number of bills that we've been able to pass, and it was over 80 that benefit small business owners. So we're making a change. Is it slow? Is it tedious? Yes. But at least they're recognizing that business owners are the real true economic engine, not just in Alabama but across the nation. And when you make their environment easy to operate, then they're more likely to expand, and that helps us all.
Yeah, and so, and again, it's important to point out, is like there are ways you can make that burden less on businesses without necessarily giving up the goals of regulation, which many times could be a worthwhile goal. But, I mean, I guess there'd also be an issue. Sometimes we have ill-conceived regulations to begin with, but we're largely talking about trying to reduce unnecessary burdens, burdens that don't really further the ends of regulation, but do burden businesses. So let's get an example of, specifically, you talk about the number of 70 or 80 bills over the last 8 years that have been able to help improve the small business environment here in Alabama. Let's get into one of the examples that your organization has been involved with over the last couple of years, and this refers is with regard to delivery licenses. And so you mentioned that businesses have to be licensed with their community, but they also have to have a delivery license, right?
Yes.
So tell us what this would be.
This is something that's very unique for Alabama. Many states do not have this. So if you are a appliance store, and people come to your store, your location, they walk in, they purchase the refrigerator, they pay for the refrigerator, they're paying the sales tax at the point of sale. But then the store, because he wants to protect his product, he doesn't want to, he wants to make sure that his delivery people own his truck, get it to the location without any damage, then cities require that company to purchase a business delivery license. So it would require the business owner to go to that city, stand in line, purchase the business delivery license, and then go back. And they may in fact have only one delivery that year. So complaints about this were so often with me. So we came up with a piece of legislation that said, if you deliver less than $10,000 into a taxing jurisdiction, then you are not required to purchase a business delivery license. And I must tell you, it was a legislative fight to get that bill passed. But members of the legislature had heard so many times from their constituents about how unfair this was, and that they just said to some municipalities, I'm not coming there. I'm just not going to do it. So this has been a big help, and this goes into effect.
And to point this out, this was a separate license. The business was already licensed, so it's not saying like they were going to be unlicensed. They were already licensed, but they had to get these extra business delivery licenses, and into every community that they wanted to, like, say, deliver one piece of furniture or one appliance. Yes,
and they're already remitting the sales tax, so it wasn't a matter of sales tax. Right. It had already been collected and remitted.
And there's also a level of a degree of unevenness across different businesses, because if you think of like Amazon, they obviously are all of their products have to be delivered, but they wouldn't necessarily have to pay a tax like this, right?
They don't pay a business delivery license because they're using a common carrier. So the law and the rule says if you use a common carrier, which is the U.S. Post Office or FedEx or whatever it happens to be, then you don't have to purchase a business delivery license. So it's your locally owned businesses that are using their vehicles with their employees, who they are remitting their employee taxes on, and those employees are spending their dollars in that community they were the ones having to purchase a business delivery license.
And how much do these licenses cost in the different
Well, they were a flat fee. They were $100, but the penalties and interest would add up very quickly. So we had people that their penalties and interest were more than the $100 and more than the item purchased. So that was really where the disagreement got pretty strong, and that's when the legislature decided to address it.
And so when you talk about the time spent going and filling out to apply for these licenses, it's under the underlying amount of revenue there was like $100 for the license. So I mean, it's a lot of time and effort to, even if you want to think of this as a revenue collection mechanism for the cities, they're not collecting all that much revenue, but it's imposing a very heavy burden on a business, right?
Oh, a very heavy burden, very heavy burden.
But you were able to get some changes made to this law and reduce that. Again, this kind of disproportionate burden that the law as it was structured was putting on especially smaller businesses, right?
Oh, it was all for small business, every bit of it.
Now, when we get into another issue, you touched on this earlier, but maybe elaborate this on a little bit. If you're a business, you have to be licensed. We understand that. And so you're licensed in the community where your business is going to be established. But in addition to delivery licenses, if you're going to do business, like say install an air conditioner or have somebody go work on an air conditioner, you have to not only be licensed where your office is, you have to be licensed in each of the communities where your technicians might be going out to service somebody's air conditioner. Right?
Yes, that is correct. So anytime you go into a municipality and you're actually doing work, then you are required to have a business license because you are in that taxing jurisdiction and you're performing work. So it is a big burden. It's not where your brick and mortar store is, and I know that a lot of your viewers, keep hearing about the U.S. Supreme Court and what we're going to do about simplified seller's use tax, but it's all about a case that the Supreme Court heard in the early 80s when it essentially said you only have taxes collected at brick and mortar stores. But when you get into municipal business license, that's a different story.
Okay.
Because municipalities have great power in order to impose these licenses.
And so if I was running an air conditioning repair business, I would have to get a license, and I would have to sort of like at the beginning of the year decide, like, am I going to have anybody go out into Brundage to repair air conditioners? If I get a call from somebody, I'd have to get a license at the beginning of the year to be able to send somebody out there, say in June when somebody's air conditioner breaks. And
or you want to pay a penalty and an interest. I mean, that's the the chance that you take. And I know a lot of, particularly florists, when you think about it, they might get a call a year for a wedding or a funeral, and is it really worth you having to purchase the business delivery license with the cost of the flowers and transporting them to the location? Is it really worth that? And I've had lots of florists tell me they've just stopped doing it.
And that's particularly ironic. I don't know if it's ironic or, but you're trying to grow your business, and you manage to have a new customer who's interested in using your business, and you've got to turn them down because of, well, you don't want to get a license to be able to just service them in that community.
Yes, I mean, it's not worth it. I mean, if you have a $75 spray, is it worth the gas, the wear and tear on your vehicle, the employee gone from your shop, plus you've got to have a business delivery license? You have to weigh it, and they look at it very closely. Another
issue with your Alabama NFIB is related to lodging taxes. So we know, well, I think maybe our viewers would know, hotels and motels get taxed. They're taxed by communities at a relatively high rate. But then that tax also gets applied to some other services that hotels, the lodging tax gets applied to some other services that you might not think of as lodging, right?
That is correct. We actually had a small business owner, and I can say their name because it is public record. It's Stonebridge Farms, and they're located in Cullman County, Alabama. They had a venue where people would rent for weddings or family reunions or class reunions, that kind of thing. And it was strictly a venue. And they decided, because people said, why don't you put a few cabins out here because we want to stay overnight. So they actually put cabins on the property, and that's when they started charging the lodging tax for the cabins. Well, the Alabama Department of Revenue sued them or cited them and said, you're supposed to be collecting lodging tax on the venue. And the business owners said, that is not what the law says. So he actually fought back and won. And we are going to codify, we have a piece of legislation that we're going to codify to be sure that the Department of Revenue never reinterprets that by saying that. In addition to that, we found out that they were charging a lodging tax on the audiovisual equipment. They were charging it on parking. If you were coming to a meeting, they were actually applying the lodging tax to parking. So we want to clear that up, and there will be a piece of legislation in the 2019 session.
And that's of relevance because the lodging tax is often higher than the sales tax, is that right?
Yes, yes, because communities control that. And what you will hear mayors and city councils say, well, these are people from coming out of town. They're not our constituents, so we're going to charge a lodging tax of 17%. So it typically is very pricey.
But then it might be a local business that's trying to have a meeting at the...
And they're being charged
and then they get charged it as well.
Yes.
So some of these are the unintended consequences or not thinking through with the impacts of some of these regulations or taxes on businesses.
Well, and that's when you get, and you must say that business owners are very brave when they step forward and they fight the taxing jurisdiction. So hats off to them for doing that.
Well, there's another tax issue that you were telling me about recently, and I thought I was really stunned by this. So I need to have you explain about this. In Alabama, we have what are referred to as bounty hunter tax collector. So tell us a little bit about what this means.
Alabama is a unique state where they have allowed third-party vendors to actually audit and collect taxes. And we have several firms that contract with cities and counties in Alabama, and they are allowed to audit and collect taxes. It could be sales tax, it can be fuel taxes. I mean, the city contract determines the scope of their work. It is somewhat unique. Many states do not allow this. So it has been a real battle, and we actually passed legislation 2 years ago to allow business owners some rights. I mean, essentially some rights. So we went through the statute and we required now all of their auditors to have graduated from an accredited school of accounting before these bounty hunter firms, or third-party vendors, I should say, are allowed to hire them as auditors. What we discovered early on is that they did not have to be an accountant. So that was one of the things that we cleaned up in the law.
And one of the shocking things, well, I guess, is that the firm that comes in and conducts the audit, their contract typically allows them to keep some portion of whatever penalties or whatever revenue they find in the course of their audit, right?
Well, they can own business license. They cannot own an audit, but a business license, as we discussed earlier, they have penalties and interest associated with them, but it's however the municipality or the county sets up the contract. But one of the things that we did at NFIB is I have a tax committee, and there are 7 CPAs and 3 tax lawyers, and they volunteer their service, and they actually put together a list, if you're being audited as a taxpayer, on what your rights are as a taxpayer. And I have sent that out many times, and it's actually posted on the NFIB website. But we want business owners to know what their rights are when they're being audited, not just by third-party companies, but by the IRS or by the Alabama Department of Revenue.
And so that would create seemingly a conflict of interest on the part of the auditor, the bounty hunter auditor, about whether they have a financial incentive to find more taxes.
They will tell you they don't.
Right.
But you know, business owners have just been, quite frankly, alarmed at some of the practices, and that was part of the legislation, is that we would try to clean up some of their practice. Mm-hmm. But it's an unusual situation when you allow a third party to collect public tax dollars.
Yes, yeah, and it raises a lot of issues that we just have a chance to, we've just touched on this today. I think this is a topic we might have to come back to at some point in the future, both the Johnson Center and maybe the NFIB. And just one other thing I wanted to talk about today is unemployment insurance. And for this, I guess we might be more familiar with unemployment on the employee side, that when you receive a pink slip or lose your job, you know you collect unemployment compensation to help pay the bills after you lose your job. But it's a little different from the employer standpoint, right? Tell us from the employer standpoint what this is. It is,
and every state is able to somewhat manage their unemployment trust fund in whatever way they want to. In Alabama, only employers pay unemployment taxes. Employees don't pay any. Mm-hmm. The other unique thing about Alabama is we actually have 4 schedules, A through D. A is the lowest unemployment taxes you can pay, and D are the highest unemployment taxes you can pay. We have been in Schedule D for almost a decade, and what we would like to do in a piece of legislation, and Senator Arthur Orr from Decatur is the sponsor of this legislation, and it would say in times where we have very low unemployment, mm-hmm. which is today, right. We have record low unemployment, that we would reduce the number of weeks that employees can draw unemployment taxes or unemployment checks. And this would create a situation where our unemployment trust fund would grow. Mm-hmm. When you get to around between $750 million to $800 million in that trust fund, then the Alabama Department of Labor thinks we'll be able to move back to Schedule C, which would reduce the number of taxes mm-hmm. that employers would pay. But unemployment taxes are necessary mm-hmm. When employees lose their job through no fault of their own, whether it's a layoff right. or a downturn, that insurance is there, and that's what it's called, insurance, mm-hmm. for employees to have that gap before they get the next job.
And so if I understand that the issue is because we don't have enough money in the trust fund, you have to have a higher tax yes. on businesses as you go along, because we really sort of more along the lines of a pay-as-you-go system. But if we could build up enough of a trust fund, then we would know we would have the money available there to pay the claims, say in the next recession yes. when unemployment is going to go up, and you could pay, businesses could pay less and still have the same benefits.
Well, and one of the things that the public generally does not know, if your unemployment trust fund goes broke, which, and you know, during the downturn there were many states that went under in their unemployment trust fund. So you borrow money from the federal government. The caveat is that if you don't pay those dollars back within 1 year, you lose your employee discount. Mm. And the Alabama Department of Labor determined that if we had lost because we did have to borrow money during mm-hmm. the downturn, we did pay it back with a one-time assessment to employers to get us back on a positive ground. When you lose that employee discount, it's about an $800 million tax increase. Oh. For employers. So that is very, very significant. That's why we need to keep the trust fund healthy.
Well, this has been fascinating. Thanks very much for coming on, and thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.